let's talk cameras. This is my camera collection. And which are the cameras I would buy if I were to start over again? And which is my favorite camera of all time? Which is the one I would keep if I could only keep one camera and shoot for the rest of my life? I'm also going to give a few suggestions for each format. And we are looking at quite a few formats here. Both film analog cameras as well as a few digital. But spoiler alert, there's a lot more film cameras than there are digital. And we are starting with the film cameras and the 35mm or full frame SLR cameras. And I would like you to just close your eyes and think of a generic film camera. I bet you it might look something like this. This is the Canon AV1. This was my father's old camera that he gifted to me in beautiful working condition. And it has that very retro look to it. It's kind of how I imagine a camera would look like. The AV1 was the follow-up to the very talked about AE1 nowadays. The difference being the AE1, which was introduced in 1976, and the AV1 in 79. Well, the AE1 was shutter priority and manual controls. This, the follow-up, the AV1, is aperture priority only. So you set the aperture on the lens, and the camera figures out the shutter for you. There's also a bulb setting, a flash setting, and a self-timer. To my knowledge, these cameras are the first that included a microchip to do the exposure calculations, and they are quite nice cameras. And the big thing with them, they introduced the FT mount with these series of cameras, the kind of A1s, and that was in 71, and they continue making glass for that mount up until 91. So there's a lot of glass available for these cameras, both professional and consumer-oriented glass. So they are nice little cameras. Moving on, we have this, another quite retro-looking camera. This is the Shinon 1000S. I don't know a ton about this camera. I do suspect the name is because the fastest shutter speed is 1/1000 of a second. Full manual control. There is an exposure meter in this that is non-functional, this camera. And this camera was gifted to me. I usually don't accept the camera gifts because people usually just want to give them their junk. But I wanted this camera. Well, not for the camera itself, even though it's quite good looking, have a wonderful mirror slap to it. But I wanted it for its mount. This is an M42 screw mount, which is very common, also referred to as the universal mount. But it was actually introduced back in, let me check, 1948 by Zeiss at their Jena plant. And they continue making glass for that for a very long time, and it was adapted by a lot of manufacturers. So there's a lot of really interesting glass for that system, and I kind of wanted a native camera for that, even though you can adapt those lenses to a lot of cameras, including some film cameras. And that's actually the only two SLR cameras I own. I don't really like SLR cameras, they are just a bit too close to digital for my taste. But I do get why people like them. They are a great entry point into film photography, and there are some really good cameras. And if I were to buy an SLR camera to start my camera collection today, well, I would buy the Rolleiflex SL35. Not because it's an especially good camera, and I don't suggest you buy one, but I find them quite interesting. It was kind of Rolleiflex's big attempt at getting into that 35mm market that was booming at the time, and they introduced the Rolleiflex SL35. They started by manufacturing them in Germany, so they were quite expensive, and they lacked a couple of features that the competitor had. So they didn't really take off. They later moved production to Singapore, and there were quite a few made, but it wasn't that great success that Rolleiflex had hoped for. But I would like to own one of those early German-made SL35s, and there was some good glass for that system. But my suggestion for you, if you're looking into getting started with film photography, definitely look at the SLR cameras. They were the most common camera type back in the film days. There's tons to choose from. The Canon A1 series, that AV1, AE1, are a great starting point, even though prices have started to, well, creep up on these because they are kind of hyped, especially the AE1. And the same goes for the Nikon F series, also great cameras. But my suggestion, look towards the Minolta or the Olympus. The Minolta X700, still very fairly priced, as well the same with the Olympus OM, and they are very competent cameras as well. Or just have a browse on eBay and see what you can find. Moving on, we are going to look at the Rangefinders. And we are starting with, well, these cameras here, that lives in the kind of never ready cases. These are Voigtlander Vito CLs. I have a CL and I have a CLR. The difference being the CLR is a rangefinder and the CL is a viewfinder. And I should probably explain what a rangefinder camera is. They are slightly different than SLRs. I do think most people are familiar with SLR cameras. They are kind of how we as modern day people think a camera should work. You look through the viewfinder and you're seeing the world through the lens, thanks to a mirror, hence the name single lens reflex. A rangefinder or a viewfinder is slightly different. Instead of looking through the lens, there's a separate viewing window right next to the lens. This has a few benefits, the key being that it allows for a bit simpler lens size as well as smaller lenses because you don't have to account for that mirror. And the body can be made a bit smaller because it doesn't have to host that mirror. Kind of like the mirrorless, or it is the mirrorless of its time. Downside? Well, there is a small difference from what you are seeing and what the camera is seeing. So there is something that is called a parallax error. And that is more pronounced the closer you are to a subject, but if you are at a normal shooting distance and far away, it's pretty much non-existent. But it is something to be aware of. And you might then wonder, well, how do you focus these cameras? Well, on some of them, you just guess the distance and use the markings on the lens and can use something called zone focusing. And on some, like this one, there is a rangefinder. And that is quite a clever system that will project two images into the viewfinder. And when you line up those two images that are projected in a small patch in the middle, you know you have found focus. The rangefinder doesn't have to be coupled to the viewfinder, but is on most cameras, like on this old Vito CLR. But the patch on this one, very dim, and you can hardly use it. It is essentially a viewfinder camera. But I do like these cameras. The Vito CL and the CLR are very vintage looking. They are kind of like your granny's old holiday snapper. Solidly built, all metal. Has this wonderful little advanced lever that wraps around the body. And then you can take a shot with the trigger being down on the body. Kind of an interesting design there. And they also had built-in meters. So this uses a little selenium meter, which is quite a cool technology from back in the days, because they didn't need any batteries. On these ones, well, you just line up two lines on the top, and that means you have found focus, so it is coupled to the lens. The downside with selenium meters, well, they are decent in daylight shooting. They struggle when it's low light, and they do deplete over time when they are exposed to light. They were rated for lasting like 70 years, but this camera, well, it was introduced in 59 and continued production up to until 68. It goes for both the CL and the CLR. And well, it's close to 70 years now, so they are starting to fail on quite a few of these cameras. They work on both of mine. That's also the reason why I keep them in their never-ready cases. Quite cool cameras. I do like them. I've used the CL quite a lot. The CLR not as much. And that's just because I got the CL before the CLR. And I thought, well, cool to have one with a rangefinder patch, and then I realized it was too dim to actually use. And moving on from the Voigtlanders, we are having a look at this. Rather elegant camera in my eyes. Very pretty. This is a Yashica Mini D, Japanese made, and the Voigtlanders, they were German made. And you can kind of get why the Japanese manufacturer got so popular and kind of surpassed the European manufacturers like the German Voigtlanders. Because this looks a lot more modern, even though it is a contemporary camera. This was introduced in, let me check, 1964. Still a fixed lens rangefinder. Has a better rangefinder patch, very usable in this one. Has also a more modern meter that does require a battery, but it's a CDS cell, but it isn't coupled to the lens. So you press the button here, and that gives you a reading up on top, and then you use that number, the EV value you get, and set that on the lens on the front, and then you know you have a correct exposure. Works okay, a bit fiddly, but kind of cool. They later upgraded these to more integrated meters. Nice, solidly made cameras with decent performance as well. I don't use this a lot though, because it has a couple of light leak issues that I've never gotten around to fix. So it's mostly sits on the shelf looking pretty. And continuing on the theme of fixed lens rangefinder and viewfinders, we have this, the Minox 35 GT. It's a tiny camera, much later, so this was introduced in 1981, and it was the smallest 35mm camera of its days. Has a tiny little lens on the front, and it is a viewfinder, so there's no rangefinder path, so you kind of just guess the distance based on the markings. I have f numbers from 2.8 up to 16, and it's a 35mm, I think. Yes, it's a 35mm lens. Quite a cool little camera. The winder is a double stroke, so you take an image and then you go like whoop, whoop. So twice strokes to advance the film. Very quiet, very discreet, great to carry in a pocket. Surprisingly sharp considering how small it is. I've done some big prints with this camera and they hold up okay. You can kind of notice that the resolution isn't quite there for the lens, but considering the size, it's not bad. I do like this. The downside with it is it uses an obsolete battery. You can use modern with it, but you have to underrate the film on the bottom. So instead of rating a film as 400, I rate it as 175. And that gives me a good enough metering. There's also on the top a little 2x switch. That is when you are shooting towards the sun, and then with double the exposure, so giving you half the shutter speed. And it is an aperture priority camera. And moving on, we're having a look at the interchangeable rangefinders. We have the Minolta CLE. This is my main shooter for 35mm. Story behind these cameras? Well, Leica and Minolta used to have an old collaborations in the 70s, and they brought out the Leica CL together, the compact Leica. However, the rumor says that they got a bit too popular for Leica's liking, as it started to cannibalize the bigger end cameras. And then a few years later, Minolta brought out this, which is essentially an upgraded version of that camera. The CLE, it was introduced in 1980. And it is quite a modern camera. It's kind of how you expect a modern camera will work. It's still all manual focus, of course, with the rangefinder system. A good rangefinder patch on the smaller side though, but very workable. Has aperture priority or full manual mode. And it has quite a good meter in it. Meters through the lens and off the film plane in a weird way that I don't quite understand, but I do know it's good. However, there's two small quirks. The first being if you put the camera in full manual mode, you can't use the meter for some reason. And the second is, to activate the meter, you put your finger on top of the shutter button, and that closes the circuitry. Quite clever and quite cool, I think. But it also means you can't use gloves with this camera. Besides that, very nice camera to use, very compact, and I do like it. And on it I have a light Summicron C 40mm f2 lens. They were introduced with this original CL cameras. Tiny lens and a quite good performer. There was also 28 and 90mm made for these cameras. And the camera has frame lines for those focal lengths. Another little quirk of it, you can't pull out the frame lines manually. So I had a friend who used a Voigtlander 35mm lens on this, because it's an M mount, so you can mount any M mount lens on it. But that meant could only use the 28mm frame line, so you can't activate the 40 manually. So just be aware of that. Besides that, a lovely camera, and as I said, it is my main shooter for 35mm. And then moving on, we finally have one more rangefinder. And this is the Contax C1, the world's first autofocus rangefinder, and almost the last. They made a follow-up called the G2, which is quite talked about nowadays. You can change the lenses on these cameras as well, but I only have the 45mm f2 color size planar lens. And it is an excellent lens. It's the best I've ever seen for these small format cameras. So that alone is worth the entry. And these have a modern meter, and they are quite modern cameras. They were introduced in 1994 and has that very 90s aesthetics to it that I quite like, especially in this kind of champagne gray. But you can kind of tell that it was supposed to be used as an autofocus and aperture priority camera. That's when they work at their best, even though they have manual focus as well as manual settings for shutter speed and aperture. The autofocus, well, a lot of people says it's slow on these cameras. I don't find it too bad. I find it quite okay considering its age of these cameras. It's single point in the middle. My problem with it is when you go like that, focus on something and want to recompose, it loses the focus lock quite easily. Partly because it's quite a squishy button here on top, so you can't really feel where the half press is. And second, well, old 90s electronics. And even though it has its quirks, I do quite like this camera. I used to use it quite a lot as a holiday snapper, general purpose photography. But the Minolta kind of taken its place, and nowadays it mostly sits on the shelf. But I keep hanging on to it because it has the most brilliant sounds ever. It's kind of like this tiny little robot that I like. So it has its place in the collection. And if I were to buy a rangefinder today, well, I would just buy a Leica, an M6 or an M7 perhaps. That's kind of the camera I really wanted, but thought was a bit too expensive. I ended up spending more money on these cameras than what a Leica used to cost. And Leica is kind of the manufacturer who was a bit stubborn and stuck with the rangefinder. Up until this day, they still produce rangefinders today, which is quite cool, when the rest of the world moved to SLRs. And my suggestion for you though, if you want to get started with rangefinders and you haven't used a rangefinder before, my suggestion is to get a fixed lens rangefinder. Those were quite common, something like this, but perhaps a later version of this. I used to have Minolta Himatic F, brilliant little camera, costs very little money, and it's a great way to, well, just try and see if you like the rangefinder, but because it is a slightly different way of shooting, which I do like. I do enjoy the rangefinders a lot more than SLRs. And if you really want an interchangeable lens rangefinder, well, the M mount is your best bet. That was kind of the one that stuck around with the stubborn Leica supporting it. And in the late 90s and the early 80s, well, there were a couple of Japanese manufacturers like this Minolta CLE that used that mount, as well as the Voigtlander Bessar, which isn't German anymore. It was bought by a Japanese company. I can't remember which one. And they brought out the Bessar. So the Bessar 2 is an excellent camera from what I've heard. And it's still a lot more affordable than the Leicas, even though prices have started to creep up on these cameras as well. My CLE, I bought it for around 1,000 euros. It's not super cheap, but considering prices of Leica, it's still very affordable. So that's my suggestion. There are a couple of older models available that is non-M mount. The two best ones being the Canon P and the Nikon S, and the S3 is the one I would go for. I do still browse eBay every now and then and look at that camera because I think it's rather beautiful, and I wouldn't mind to add it to my collection. But I am saving up for that Leica. Moving on, we're having a look at the TLRs of medium format, and I have a couple of those. Starting off, we have this. This is the Icoflex made by Zeiss. I think this is the 1A or 2A. My first kind of TLR camera and one of my very first film cameras. If you didn't know, TLR cameras, well, that's twin lens reflex cameras. You have one lens for focusing and one for taking the image. Quite a clever design because it means the cameras are a bit smaller because the lenses can be made a bit simpler, kind of like the same benefit as with the rangefinders. And most of them, well, they use a waist level finder. And this one has kind of a cool pop-up hood on it. Good matte screen on this one, quite bright. And this camera, they are kind of more consumer-oriented cameras, the Icoflexes, even though they were kind of the high-end consumer cameras. Fastest shutter speed 1/300 seconds, kind of a bit over-engineered as a lot of the German cameras. So you have to cock the shutter manually, and there's a lot of lockout mechanisms to prevent double exposures. But they are quite cool, and I do like them. I do have 3 of them, so I must like them. So besides this one, I also have 2 1Cs, which were a bit later. So this first one, the 1A, let me see, were introduced in 52 and made up until 56. And this, the 1C, was made in 56, and I do think it only had 1 production run. Kind of an updated version, a bit better design of the lens hood. Has a built-in selenium meter that is hidden under a little flap. And they move the shutter button down to the side. I do really like these. I have 2, and none of them is in perfect condition, so I kind of bought them as repair objects. So I'm hoping that I can make one working condition of these 2 cameras. All of the Icoflexes either used a Nova lens or a Zeiss lens. They're decent performance if you step them down 1 stop or something like that. So I do like these cameras. But to be honest, I really wanted one of these. This is a Rolleiflex. This is kind of a mid-of-the-range Rolleiflex at 3.5, but they are a lot better designed than the Icoflexes, and they were more high-end. These were professional cameras used by journalists all over the world, and were very popular, and they made very many of these cameras, and produced for a very long time. So the first Rolleiflex was introduced in 1928, and the last one, 2014. A really long production run for these cameras. And I can get why. They are beautiful machines, and I really like this camera. I use it quite a lot for like street photography. They are kind of made for that, and they're quite famously used by Vivian Maier for that. Max shutter speed 1/500 a second. And they had 4 different glasses on them. So you had 2.8 and 3.5, and then you had the Schneider and Zeiss glass. The sizes, you had the testers and the planar. The testers are considerably lesser and In the Planner, the more high-end. On the Schneider side, you had the Xenars and the Senators, considered being the more high-end ones. And I didn't know this before, but the Senators, I thought these were only available as 2.8, but this is a Senator 3.5, so apparently they made those as well. And then finally, we have the big beta of TLRs. This is the Mamiya C33. A kind of Mamiya in true Mamiya fashion going, well, we are going to make the best we can and we don't care how bulky it gets. So it is quite chunky. So this weighs around 2.5 kilograms or something like that with the lens. And these smaller ones, well, they are less than a kilogram. So it's more than double the weight. But they are really cool. They are the first TLR and the only TLRs to offer interchangeable lenses, to my knowledge. And they had two versions of these. They had a C2 and a C3, and then a couple different generations of those. The C3 had a couple more features than the C2, even though both were similar performance. Has kind of a bellow system for focusing to account for all the focal length. The longest I think was a 250 for this one, and the shortest a 55. And I did buy this camera not because the interchangeable lenses. I bought it because I wanted a bit more reach with my TLR for some urban photography. So I have a 105 for this. And they are pretty much the only option if you want a bit more reach with the TLRs. Most of them use the 80 or 75mm lens on them, which is the standard format for 6x6, which most of the TLRs used. But there are a couple more options if you want a more reach. Rolleiflex actually made a tele and a wide. And the story says that the Rolleiflex kind of got spooked by Mamiya when they were bringing out these interchangeable lens TLRs. And so they started to develop that, but in the end they just released a tele and a wide. But those are quite rare and very expensive. There was also a French manufacturer called Sem that made a Semflex that was also available as a tele at least, and I do think they had a wide as well. But those are also quite rare and quite expensive. So I went with the Mamiya. And if I were to buy a TLR and start over, well, I would go with a Rolleiflex. And I would buy the best I could afford. I really want a 2.8, but I always thought it was a bit too expensive. But if I were to start over, I would skip all the others and get a Rolleiflex 2.8, ideally a Planner. But that's me. My suggestion for you, if you want to get started with TLR cameras, well, the Icoflexes, decent performance, a bit fiddly, so they are great. Around €100 you can get one of these. But my best suggestion, look towards the Yashica Matte. It's an excellent camera for very little money. So if you can get hold of one of those, go for that. Or if you really want a Rolleiflex, go for that. It is a classic and a true beauty to use. And as I said, around €250 for this one, so not too bad if you look around for a bit. So moving on, we are going to look at the foldable cameras, or the shelf cameras that I have behind me here. These are really old school, and I have two of them. First we have the Kodak Valenta 620. This is in non-functional conditions, so I've never used it. And it uses an obsolete film format, so it just sits on the shelf. And then I have this. This is a Voigtlander Bessa, a pre-war version. It's kind of cool to have a really old camera in my collection. Uses a Voigtlander lens, and it is a f6.3. Unsure of what focal length it is, but I do know it uses 60x9 as its format. Has a tiny little dim viewfinder here that you can hardly use, as well as a little sport finder on the side. Kind of cool to see how long we come with the camera technology. I still haven't used this. I might take it out someday just to try it out and see how it was back in the day. So the Bessas they were made in, let me check, 1930s. And these ones, 44 to 39. Quite cool to have them, but they are mostly just decoration. With that said though, don't dismiss the foldable totally. Later ones, like in the 50s, there were a couple of decent performers made, and you can have them for quite affordable prices today because people generally don't like them. Like the size icons, that would be quite a nice camera. But me personally, I'm not too interested in the foldable, so my best suggestion for myself and you, the size icon, because I don't know enough about those cameras to make a true good suggestion. Moving on, we are having a look at the SLRs of medium format, and I only have one, and it's this one. It is a classic though, it's a Hasselblad. It's not the 500 though, this is the 2003 FCW. So it's a later version of Hasselblad. They introduced this alongside the 500, so it never replaced the old 500. The difference being though, the 2000 series, they use a focal plane shutter instead of a leaf shutter in the lenses, which is quite cool, so they could achieve faster shutter speeds. So this one supports 1/2000 of a second, which is the big selling point. The old 500, well, they were named so because the fastest shutter speed was 1/500 of a second. The 2000 though, they can use all the lenses, so you can use the older C lenses and the CF lenses that were made for the 500 series, but it also supports the new lenses called the F lenses. They lack the shutter, and hence the shutter in the camera. But on the plus side, they will stop faster, and that's the reason why I went with the 2000 series, because I wanted access to those lenses. And I still haven't acquired an F lens beside this standard lens. And the funny thing with that, it's the exact same as the old CF and even the C lenses, the same formula and the same speed on them, so they are f2.8. Because F lenses, as it turns out, are quite expensive. And so it goes with most of the Hasselblad stuff. They are expensive. As long as it says Hasselblad, you are paying a premium. I got this camera a couple of years ago. I paid around 600 euros, I think, with the standard lens. So they were introduced the first 2000 in '84. And they continued that run up until 2004. So the last one in this series is the 205 FCC. But the funny thing, the 500, the last 500 is the 503 CW, and that ended production in 2006. Kind of funny that the old school series outlived the newer 2000 series. So that's not my only SLR. I used to have an RB as well by Mamiya. Once again, a big chunky camera. And it was wonderful, great performer if you can live with the bulk of it. But I realized I really want a Hasselblad, so I kind of just sold that to buy this camera. And it comes to no one's surprise that if I were to buy an SLR medium format, I would buy a Hasselblad again. Probably I would try and go for the 503 CW if I could find it for a decent price, but I really like this camera. My suggestion though, if you're looking into getting an SLR camera for medium format, there are a lot better options or perhaps cheaper options that are equal to the Hasselblads. The thing with the Hasselblad, you have to understand this style of camera. They are true system cameras, so you can replace the backs and the finder, and as well as the winder on these cameras, and the lens of course. And that design of medium format cameras is kind of the one to go for in my book. And Mamiya had an excellent option beside the RB called the Mamiya 645. I used 645 as the negative instead of 6x6 like on these Hasselblad, even though you can get 645 backs for these as well. That's a great performer, and it's a lot cheaper than this. Still currently the best deal on the market in my book. We also had a couple of offerings by Bronica, the later ones, the ETSR for 645, as well as the SQ for the square 6x6 format. Also excellent performance and pretty much half price compared to the Hasselblad. And quality-wise, they aren't that far off from the Hasselblads. That would be my suggestion for you if you want to get started with SLR cameras that are medium format. And finally, we have an odd one when it comes to medium format. This is an under Pinhole camera that uses 6x12 negatives. It's a multi-format though, so it supports both 6x12, 6x9 and 6x6. And it's a lovely camera, it has this very nice look to it, all wood. Looks kind of like an old stereo or radio, and I find it quite attractive. Really well made. Made a separate video about it that you can check out later. Pinhole photography, different than any other photography. Instead of a lens, you just have a small little pinhole. And that gives you very eternal looking images that are sharp everywhere, but isn't sharp anywhere. So it's quite fun medium to explore. And I would buy the same again. I would buy an under. They are beautiful and made new today. I paid, I think, 250 euros for these, and currently they're selling for like 300 something. Worth the money. But you could also just make your own if you like. That could be quite a fun project. And moving on, we are moving up to the big boys, the large format. And we are starting with this. This is a Saba camera. These are Swedish-made cameras, produced from 45 to 62. And the story goes, they were a man named Saba that came to Sweden from Hungary, immigrated to Sweden, and he started to make cameras. Originally he wanted to start to become a flight engineer, but ended up making cameras. I do think they originally was sold to Hasselblad, so he sold 50 cameras to Hasselblad, and they were later resold and branded as the Hasselblad Universal camera. And then he set up his own shop and produced these cameras. I do think this is an early model called the red ones, made of mahogany. Quite nice studio cameras, but they are quite compact when you fold them down. And this one weighs around 2 kilograms. I used it for about a year and worked quite well. Cool to have a Swedish made. In total, he produced around 2,000 cameras and had different formats. So there were the 4x5s, the 5x7, as well as the 8x10s. My only problem with this camera is the lens. The locking mechanism for the lens board, you cannot push it down, and there's a couple of springs pushing up the lens to hold it in place. It's really fiddly to replace the lens on these ones. Later ones had a more typical locking mechanism for the lenses that were a lot easier to use. And I don't know if this was so originally or if it has been modified. But a cool camera. I have replaced it though, so it mostly sits on the shelf. Nowadays I use this one. This is a Linhof Technica 5, still a 4x5 and my main working horse, 4x5. It's a beautiful camera, very sturdy, all metal built. It is on the heavier side. I think it weighs around 2.5 kilograms. But I really like it because it folds down to a very compact kit, and it was made to be able to handheld these cameras. You have a rangefinder on the side, you could put a viewfinder on top, but what I like about them is that you have a pop-out hood on the back, like so. And that's quite good because I can go like so to find compositions when I find something I like before setting it on the tripod. A lot of cameras was made in this style, but I think the Linhof is the best, even though it is a bit more expensive because it's German made. And this is the Technica 5, produced from '63. Very many generations of these cameras, and they are even made new today, even though they are super expensive. If you want to buy a new one, I think like 20,000 euros for a new Technica. And I still use it. It's, as I said, it's my main working horse for the 4x5. And moving on, we have my largest camera in my collection. And this is a Under Aiken 4x10. It's a really beautiful camera that I really like. I made a separate video about this that you can check out. So 4x10, a niche format, panoramic large format that is quite cool to explore. This is quite light considering its size. So it weighs just under 2 kilograms without the lens, which is quite impressive. Very well made. I really like this camera. Haven't used it as much as I would like to though. Partly because, well, that odd format, I only have 2 film holders for that. I do have a reducing back for it as well, so I could use it for with 4x5, but I'm lacking a couple of lens ports for it, so I haven't gotten around to getting those. So I only have this lens on it that is for 4x10, 250mm Fujinon lens, which is kind of a standard focal length for that format, even though it's strange. Quite a fun format to explore. I really like this camera and hoping to use it more in the future. So that's my large format cameras, and if I were to buy a large format camera today, I would probably still buy the Technica, the Linhof Technica. I would try and get hold of a later one though, the Technica Master, that forgoes that rangefinder model, because I don't use that, it's just a dead weight to me. And they also introduced a little flap on the body to give a bit more movements to wider lenses, which I think would be quite nice, for even with this my wide angle, which is a 90mm, so not super wide when it comes to 4x5. It is quite limited with the movements. It would be nice to have that little flap. So that's one I would try and save up to. The Under would have been a close second though, perhaps not the 4x10 if I could only have one large format camera. As a secondary large format camera, I'd definitely still buy it. But the Under Aiken range 4x5 looks brilliant, and it's the same construction as this. So I would go with that or the Linhof, but I think the Linhof takes the price. And if you are looking to get into large format, I made a separate video going over everything else you need with the large format, because it's not enough to just get the camera. But a fast suggestion for a camera, the Intrepid. The Intrepid 4x5 looks bloody brilliant and made new today. But there are plenty of options in the used market as well. And I do think that's all of the film cameras. Yep, it is. So moving on, we are looking at the digital cameras. And we are starting with these two. In total, I have 3 digital cameras. The first one is this one. This is a Fujifilm X-H1. It was its best of its generation, and the problem is it was its last of its generation. This uses the X-Trans 2 sensor by Fujifilm, and it's an APS-C camera. And it was excellent. However, a few months later, after this was introduced, they introduced the X-T3 with a new sensor and vastly improved autofocus. So I always have a kind of a hate-love relationship with this camera, even though I find it brilliant. I used it a ton when I still did digital photography. Shot a lot of events with this camera and it performed brilliantly, even though the autofocus in low light, not the best. But I shot quite a few events with this, mostly dance events, because if you didn't know, I'm a Lindy Hopper, and those two worlds of photography and dance kind of met. I did a few commissioned work as well as some personal fun projects. I later on replaced this camera with the Fujifilm X-H2, which is my current digital camera. I found that brilliant. It's a great photography camera and a hybrid camera for video making. I have used it primarily for video making nowadays for my YouTube videos. For photography, it's not as fun anymore. It's kind of also the camera that killed photography, digital photography for me, because it just gotten too easy. So I kind of went all in on film photography instead. But I do have one digital camera that I still use, and it is this one. It's a tiny little pocketable camera, compact camera. Fixed lens on it is the Lumix LX100 made by Panasonic. Quite a cool camera. The first digital camera I bought when I kind of rediscovered photography. Quite a good performer. 12 megapixel micro four thirds sensor on this one. I've taken quite a few nice images with this back in days. But then it ended up sitting on the shelf quite a long time when I kind of upgraded to other cameras. But then, well, last year, I converted this to an infrared camera and started using it more like that. And it's quite fun to explore. So I still use this, and I discovered that I really like this camera. It has kind of that retro design with the dials and stuff like that. It's quite a nice camera, and they have gotten quite expensive. So when I bought this new, I paid, I think, 5,000 euros. 500 euros for it. And they are selling for like 500 euros today as well. When I tried to sell this off, I asked for 250 and no one wanted to buy it. So things have changed. But I do think that's thanks to its retro design, which is quite hyped today. And if I were to buy a digital camera today, I would probably still buy the H2. I would look for a used though. Because it's an excellent hybrid camera and I already have the glass for that system. I do really like the small primes that Fujifilm make for the system. It makes it a very compact kit. I currently use the 60mm f2.8 for when I want a very small compact kit for my photography vlog videos. And I'm using that to film myself currently. As well as when I need a bit more reach, there's that very incredibly versatile 60mm 80 f4 lens. I use that quite a lot as well. And because I already have that glass for that system, well, the Fujifilm makes sense. Because to me, digital cameras have become utilities. They are like buying a new microwave. There are differences, but I don't get excited by it. So if I didn't have the glass, I would just look for the best deal I could find. Currently, I have seen quite a good deal for a couple of the Canons, the R5, the R6 and the R7. They look excellent, and more importantly, they are kitted with some decent glass to get started with. But that is my suggestion to you. If you are going to buy a digital camera, just go with the best deal you can find. There's very little in it between the different manufacturers. Instead, it's more like, do you want more consumer-oriented camera or more of a professional-like camera? But I must say, there are two new digital cameras that kind of excite me and might sway me to do more photography, more digital photography. One of them is the Hasselblad 907X. Kind of more like shooting with one of these old school waist level finder medium format cameras. So I would really like one of those, but they are super expensive, way out of my price range. And the other one, well, that's the Leica, the stubborn Leica that still makes rangefinders, and I do like myself a rangefinder. And I almost bought a monochrome version of one of the Leica, a used one, even though they are expensive. But in the end, I just ended up buying more film cameras. But I would like a Leica, even though they are very expensive. And I do think that's it. That's all my cameras. There's only one question left. Which is the camera I would keep if I could only shoot one camera for the rest of my life? Well, it's surprisingly easy for me. It's the Hasselblad. It has always been the Hasselblad. I really like this camera, and it's the one I would keep. With that said, thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time. Take care, and bye.
Thank you.